There is a letter that Jacqueline Kennedy wrote on the evening of November 22nd, 1963. She wrote it in the bedroom of the Johnson Ranch in Texas, on White House stationery that someone had thought to bring from Air Force One, sitting at a small desk while the new President of the United States was in the room below receiving calls from people who needed to speak to the President of the United States and who could not yet quite process that the President of the United States was now someone other than the man who had been the President of the United States that morning. She had been in the same clothes for several hours. She had declined to change them. When Lady Bird Johnson had suggested gently and with the specific tact of a woman who understood that the suggestion might not be welcome, that she might want to freshen up before the swearing in, Jackie Kennedy had said no. She said, "Let them see what they've done." She was 34 years old. Her husband's blood was on the pink suit. She was not going to clean it off. The letter she wrote that evening was to her children. It was a letter explaining in terms that a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old could eventually understand who their father had been and what had happened to him. She did not know if she would be able to tell them herself later, in the ordinary way that mothers tell children things. She was not sure in those hours about very much. She was sure about the letter. She sealed it and gave it to someone who would keep it. And then she went down to the swearing in and stood beside Lyndon Johnson while he took the oath, and she held in her face, in front of the cameras and the official photographer, and the small group of aides and officials assembled in the cabin of Air Force One, an expression that has been studied and written about and described for 60 years, and that has never been fully decoded, because the expression contains everything, and the everything is not available for decoding. It is the expression of a woman who has decided what she is going to show the world, and the world is looking at the decision, not at what is behind it. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you what was behind it. Not the decision, not the image, not the expression that has been printed on 1,000 magazine covers and written about in 100 biographies. The thing behind all of that, the thing that Jacqueline Kennedy spent the 31 years after Dallas protecting with the same absolute completeness with which she had protected everything else in a life that had required, from its very beginning, the protection of the interior from the exterior. Because here's what I want you to understand before we go back to the beginning, before we go to Southampton and Newport and the particular world of the East Coast American upper class in the late 1920s and 1930s that produced her. The pain that Jacqueline Kennedy carried was not only the pain of Dallas. Dallas was the event that the world assigned to her, the grief that the world gave her to carry, the tragedy that the photographs and the pink suit and the Capitol Rotunda attached to her name. But the pain that she actually carried from long before Dallas and all the way through to her death in May of 1994 was older than that and wider than that and more complicated than the single event that the world had decided defined her. She had been practicing the protection of the interior from the exterior since she was a child. By the time she stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and at the Capitol and in the doorways of the White House in the days after the assassination, demonstrating to the country and to the world, and to historians not yet born, a quality of composed dignity that has never been equaled in the public life of the American Republic. She had been doing the work of that composure for 34 years. Dallas required it in its most extreme form, but it did not invent it. So, come with me. We are going back to Southampton, New York, in the year 1929, to a family of the specific American kind that is called aristocratic without quite being aristocratic, which is to say a family with money and social position and the particular confidence of people who have been told since childhood that the world is organized for their comfort, and who have not yet been given sufficient reason to doubt it. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on the 28th of July, 1929. Her father was John Verneau Bouvier, the third, who was called Black Jack by the people who loved him, and by himself, a man of extraordinary physical magnetism and absolutely catastrophic personal behavior, who drank too much and gambled too much, and was unfaithful to his wife too often and too openly for the infidelity to remain a private matter, and who loved his daughter in the specific way of men like him, completely and unreliably and in ways that were the source of both the greatest security and the deepest wound of her life. Her mother was Janet Lee Bouvier, a woman of a different kind of determination than her husband, the kind that does not dissipate in drink and charm, but accumulates into a quality of iron will that her daughter would inherit in a form that was more effective because it was less visible. Janet was not warm in the way of women who are praised for their warmth. She was exacting and formal and had opinions about how things should be done that she communicated with a directness that her daughter would later describe, in the careful language of someone describing a parent, as demanding. She had expectations. They were maintained. The marriage between Blackjack Bouvier and Janet Lee Bouvier was a marriage that should not have happened and that produced 2 daughters before it ended, formally, in divorce in 1940. Jackie was 10 years old. Her sister Lee was 6. The divorce was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the marriage because the marriage had been providing regular evidence that it was in difficulty since nearly its beginning, and the evidence had not been private evidence but the public kind, involving affairs that were known in the social world the Bouvier inhabited and scenes that were observed by people who talked about what they had seen. The divorce did not end the father. He remained in Jackie's life, and the quality of his presence in it, the weekends in New York, the summers on the East Coast, the particular emotional intensity of a relationship between a father and a daughter who has been separated from the father by the legal dissolution of the family and who has therefore developed a relationship to that father that is more concentrated than the ordinary relationship because it exists in defined, bounded intervals rather than in the continuous proximity of daily life. That quality shaped her in ways that she herself analyzed, in the rare moments of genuine self-disclosure in her life, with the accuracy of a woman who had thought carefully about the subject. She said in a conversation with the author Rosamond Bernier in the 1980s that her relationship with her father had been the defining relationship of her early life, and that the defining quality of that relationship had been its unreliability. He was unreliable in the practical ways. He sometimes didn't appear when he had said he would appear. He sometimes arrived in states that were the states of a man who had been drinking since before the occasion began. And he was unreliable in the emotional way that is harder to name and harder to recover from, which is the way of a man whose attention is extraordinary when it is present and absent when it is not, and whose presence and absence follow a schedule that the person, depending on the attention, does not have access to in advance. This is the specific education in love that Jacqueline Bouvier received from the first man she loved. The education taught her that love is intense and intermittent, and that the intensity and the intermittence are connected, that the intermittence is partly what produces the intensity, and that the person who loves this way is not loving badly in the sense of loving without genuine feeling, but loving in the only way they know, which produces in the person being loved a specific kind of longing that does not entirely resolve, regardless of what subsequently happens. She was brilliant. This is a fact about Jacqueline Kennedy that the image of her tends to obscure, because the image is so powerful and so defined by physical qualities, the beauty, the clothes, the specific quality of her visual presence in photographs, that the intellectual dimension gets reduced to a supporting detail rather than a central fact. She read voraciously from childhood. She wrote poetry that was recognized by her teachers as genuinely good, not good for a student, but good in the sense that the language was doing something with images and emotions that most adults could not do. She spoke French and learned Spanish and studied Italian. She won Vogue's Prix de Paris in 1951, a prestigious writing competition, and the prize was a year working at Vogue in Paris and New York, which she accepted and then relinquished at her mother's insistence because Janet Bouvier, who had by then remarried the financier, Hugh Auchincloss, had views about what was appropriate for a young woman of her daughter's social position, and a year at a fashion magazine was not unambiguously among them. She went to the Sorbonne in Paris in 1949 and 1950 at the age of 19 and 20, and the year she spent in France was, by her own account, one of the most important years of her life. Paris was not the social world of Newport and Southampton and the debutante circuit that had organized her adolescence. Paris was something else, a city with a relationship to beauty and art and literature and the life of the mind that was different from anything available in the world she had grown up in, and the encounter with it produced in her a quality of aesthetic appetite that was genuine and that would organize the rest of her life in ways that were more profound than the biographers focused primarily on the political dimensions of her story have generally credited. She came back from Paris and enrolled at George Washington University and worked as a photographer for the Washington Times-Herald, and moved through the social world of Washington in the early 1950s, which was the world of the political class of the most powerful country in the world at the moment of its greatest post-war confidence. She met senators and congressmen and diplomats and the people who moved between those categories. She was observed. She was, by every account of people who encountered her in those years, remarkable in the sense that applies to people who are so clearly more than the category they occupy that the category becomes inadequate in their presence. She met John Kennedy at a dinner party in Georgetown in May of 1951. The account of the meeting varies by source in the specific way that accounts of famous meetings vary. Everyone remembers it slightly differently. The details shift, the emphasis changes depending on whose story it is. What is consistent across the accounts is that he was interested in her immediately, and that she was not immediately willing to demonstrate that the interest was reciprocated, because she was not a woman who demonstrated things about herself before she had decided to demonstrate them, and she had not yet decided. She decided over the following 2 years, in the careful and deliberate way of a woman who had inherited from her father and her mother 2 very different lessons about what happens when you commit yourself to someone without full information about what the commitment will cost. She had seen from the inside what a marriage looked like when the person you married was charming and unreliable and unfaithful. She was not naive about what she was considering. She was 23 years old and she was considering it anyway, because John Kennedy was what he was. The specific combination of intelligence and ambition and physical presence, and that quality that his family had, and that their world generated in people who had been told since childhood that they were destined for something, a quality of forward motion that was almost irresistible to be near. And because the alternative, which was to decline the thing in front of her on the grounds that she had good reasons to be cautious, was not the choice she was going to make, they were married on September 12, 1953, in Newport. The wedding was one of the social events of the season and was covered by the press with the attention that the marriage of a Catholic congressman from Massachusetts to the daughter of a prominent East Coast family received in 1953, which was significant, but not yet the attention that the subsequent decade would train on everything associated with the name Kennedy. She was 24. He was 36. What she knew about him before the marriage, and what she discovered after it, and the relationship between those 2 bodies of knowledge, is the question that sits at the center of everything that followed, because it is the question of how much she knew and what she did with what she knew, and what it cost her to manage the gap between the knowing and the not knowing over the 11 years of the marriage. She knew before the marriage that he was not a man constituted for fidelity. She knew this not as a rumor or a suspicion, but as a fact, because the social world she inhabited was not large, and the information it circulated was reliable. She had heard specific things about specific episodes. She was not a woman who proceeded without information. She proceeded, as I said anyway, and the decision to proceed was her decision, made with whatever calculation and hope and the specific willingness to take a risk that attends the decision to marry anyone when the information available is incomplete in ways that no amount of additional information will fully remedy. What she discovered after the marriage was the full scale of what the decision involved. The specific details of John Kennedy's infidelities during the marriage have been documented extensively in the decades since his death, in biographies and memoirs and historical accounts of his presidency. And I will not rehearse them here in full because the rehearsal is not the point. The point is the shape of what his behavior required of her, and what the management of that shape cost over 11 years. What it required first and most practically was the construction and maintenance of a public image of a marriage that did not correspond in all its particulars to the private reality of the marriage. This is a requirement that the Kennedys, as a family and as a political enterprise, understood and expected and applied not only to the marriage itself, but to every aspect of the public presentation of the family. The Kennedy operation, the family, the political apparatus, the machinery of image and narrative that had been building for decades, beginning with Joseph Kennedy's systematic investment in the creation of a dynasty, was premised on the management of public perception in ways that were comprehensive and disciplined. And Jacqueline Kennedy became, from the first moments of the marriage, part of the managed image, whether she had chosen to be or not. She had opinions about the management. She was not passive about the construction of her own image. She was intelligent about it in the way that a woman who had been working as a photographer and had grown up in a world where image and reality were understood to be related but not identical is intelligent about it. She made choices. She chose what to wear and how to be photographed, and what to say in interviews, and how to present herself to the public. She made the choices with a quality of considered intentionality that her biographers, even the sympathetic ones, have sometimes described as calculating, as though calculation were a criticism rather than a description of the work of a person managing a complicated situation. The situation was complicated in ways that went beyond the infidelities, though the infidelities were central to it. It was complicated by the health that she and her husband both carried imperfectly. John Kennedy's health was, throughout his public life, managed with a thoroughness that constituted a deception of the public in ways that have been documented and analyzed since. His back pain, his Addison's disease, the medications he was on, none of this was disclosed. And the image of vitality and physical capability that the Kennedy operation constructed and maintained was a construction in a more fundamental sense than the ordinary construction of a public image, because it was a construction in the face of medical reality that pointed in a different direction. Jackie Kennedy knew about the medical reality. She managed her relationship to it with the same quality of steady composure that she managed everything else in the private life of the marriage. She was not a woman who demanded that the difficulties be acknowledged. She was a woman who understood that certain difficulties were not going to be acknowledged and who organized herself around that understanding with a practical intelligence that was itself a form of strength. She was also managing her own grief, which had begun before Dallas, and which Dallas intensified into something that the world then mistook for its origin. She had lost 2 children. This is the fact about Jacqueline Kennedy's private experience of the marriage that the public image of the Camelot years most completely obscures, and it is worth stating plainly. She lost a child in 1956, a stillborn daughter who was named Arabella, and she lost a child in August of 1963, a son named Patrick who was born prematurely and lived for 39 hours. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born on August 7, 1963, 3 months before Dallas. He was born 5.5 weeks early, at Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod, by emergency cesarean section. He weighed 4 pounds and 10.5 ounces. He had hyaline membrane disease, which is now called respiratory distress syndrome, a condition in which the lungs of a premature infant lack the surfactant necessary for the air sacs to remain open between breaths. In 1963, there was no effective treatment for it. The condition produced a progressive respiratory failure that was, in the medical understanding and the medical capability of 1963, not reversible. Patrick Kennedy died on August 9, 1963, at the Children's Medical Center in Boston. He was 39 hours old. He died in an oxygen-enriched incubator, and John Kennedy was with him at the end. And John Kennedy wept, which was not something that the people around him had seen him do in the way that he wept that morning. Jackie Kennedy was at Otis Air Force Base when the news reached her, recovering from the cesarean section, and the people around her in those hours have described her reaction in terms that are careful and oblique in the way of people describing a grief they did not know how to witness. She had lost Arabella in 1956 while her husband was on a boat with friends in the Mediterranean, receiving reports about his wife's condition by radio, and she had recovered from that loss in the private way, without public acknowledgement, without the kind of mourning that the culture offers mechanisms for, because the culture of 1956 did not offer mechanisms for the mourning of a stillborn child in the way that later decades would begin to develop. She had carried the loss inside the public image of the marriage for 7 years. And then, 3 months before Dallas, the loss was repeated in the form of Patrick, and she was still in the process of that grief, of the specific, acute grief of a mother who has lost an infant, which is a grief with its own particular quality of physical immediacy because the body that carried the child is still recovering from the carrying. When the motorcade went through Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. The 22nd is the date everyone knows. It is the date that organized everything that came after it in the public understanding of her life. But August 9th is the date that I want to sit with for a moment, because August 9th is the date that the official history has not given the attention it deserves. Patrick's death did not receive the national response that the president's death received, because Patrick was not the president. But for Jackie Kennedy, in the private interior of her life, Patrick's death was the wound that was still open when the larger wound arrived. Dallas organized the grief into the form the world received it in. It gave it a name: assassination, widow, tragedy, and a set of images and a national ritual of mourning and a place in history. It transformed a private woman's private grief into a public event of the largest possible scale. And in doing so, in some ways, it made the grief both more visible and less visible simultaneously, because the public grief, the rotunda, the caisson, the eternal flame, the children at the steps, was real and was hers, and was also, as everything in her public life had always been, managed. It was managed in the service of something larger than her own pain, which was the nation's pain, and the service of something larger than your own pain is both ennobling and its own form of cost. The black dress and the veil, the dignity, the hand on John's shoulder as he saluted the coffin, the lighting of the eternal flame. These images have been reproduced so many times and have been so thoroughly incorporated into the national iconography of the 20th century that they have acquired a kind of permanence that separates them from the person who is producing them. They look, from the distance of 60 years, like historical documents rather than the expressions of a 34-year-old woman's chosen response to the worst event of her life. They were both. She had decided, in the hours between Dallas and the Capitol, what her public response was going to be, and the decision was made with the same quality of deliberate intentionality with which she had always made the decisions about her public self. She decided that the country needed something from her, and she decided what that something was, and she provided it with a completeness and a discipline that required from her, in the days of the funeral, an effort that can only be partly understood by people who have not been required to provide anything comparable. What it cost her in the years that followed is what the biographers and the people who knew her in those years have tried to describe and have never quite captured to the satisfaction of the person they were describing. She moved out of the White House in December 1963. She moved into an apartment on Georgetown with her children. She was 34 years old, and she was the most famous woman in the world, and she was a widow who had lost 2 children and a husband in the span of 7 years, and who was doing the ordinary daily work of motherhood, getting Caroline to school, making sure John had his lunch, managing the household, in the specific context of the most catastrophic public grief of her century. She was also being watched, in the specific way that the famous are watched, and in the specific, intensified way that the famous in grief are watched, which is with the particular quality of attention that combines sympathy with a kind of consumption, a need to see the grief, to observe its progression, to witness its management, to be reassured by its apparent resolution or concerned by its apparent persistence. The watching was relentless, and she managed it with the same discipline she had always brought to being watched, which was the discipline of a woman who has decided what she is going to show and who shows it while keeping everything else in the place where the cameras do not go. She had help. Bobby Kennedy was the most important of the people who helped her in the years immediately following the assassination, and the relationship between Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy in those years is one of the most genuinely moving things in the whole long story of the Kennedy family, which is a story that contains a great deal that is moving alongside a great deal that is not. Bobby had been, during the marriage, one of the people in the Kennedy family who treated her with the specific quality of genuine regard that acknowledged her as a person rather than as a member of the political apparatus, and after the assassination, he extended to her and to her children the kind of protective, attentive presence that she needed, and that he provided without making it a performance of his own grief. He called her every day. He was present for the children. He took her and the children on trips to Aspen, to Antigua, to the places that were outside the specific geography of the life that had been destroyed and that offered, therefore, a kind of respite. He was, in the years between Dallas and his own death in June of 1968, the person in her life who most consistently provided what she most needed, which was the presence of someone who loved her without requiring her to be the icon, without requiring her to maintain the public image, without requiring her to be anything other than the person she was in the private room of herself where the cameras did not go. He was shot on June 5, 1968, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, shortly after midnight following his victory in the California Democratic primary. He was 42 years old. He died 26 hours later at Good Samaritan Hospital. Jackie Kennedy was in New York when the news reached her. She flew to Los Angeles. She was at the hospital. She attended the funeral. She stood in the specific way that she stood for things, with the composure that the world had come to understand as her characteristic response to the unendurable, and the world received it as it had always received it, as evidence of her extraordinary strength. What the composure contained in June of 1968 was something that the people closest to her in those weeks described in terms that were more specific than the general language of grief. It contained, in addition to the grief itself, a specific and concrete fear. She said it to people in those days. She said it without the careful management that usually attended her public statements. She said, "They are shooting all the Kennedys, and I don't want my children to be next." This is the thing that the official story of Jacqueline Kennedy's life does not fully account for. The thing that the composure contains without revealing. The fear, not the grief, which was visible even through the composure, or visible enough that the world understood it was there, even if it could not see it directly. The fear, the specific concrete fear of a woman who had been in a motorcade in Dallas in November of 1963 and who had watched her husband's head and who had then, in June of 1968, lost the other Kennedy, and who had 2 children who were Kennedys, and who understood with the clarity of a person for whom the fear was not theoretical but experiential, that the country she was living in was capable of killing the people she loved. The marriage to Aristotle Onassis in October of 1968, the marriage that shocked the world, that made the cover of every magazine, that caused the Vatican to describe her as a sinner, and caused women in America to weep, and caused Theodore White, who had created the Camelot narrative in the first place, to feel, by his own account, something close to personal betrayal. That marriage has been explained in various ways by various people over the various decades since it happened. It has been explained as a financial arrangement because Onassis was one of the wealthiest men on earth. It has been explained as a reaction to grief, a reaching for stability in the form of someone powerful enough to seem protective. It has been explained as a liberation, as a woman refusing the role of eternal American widow and claiming a private life on her own terms. All of those explanations contain something true. The explanation that contains the most truth is the one that takes the fear seriously. She wanted to take her children somewhere safe. She wanted to be somewhere that was not the country that had killed her husband and then killed Bobby Kennedy. She wanted to be surrounded by something larger and more powerful than the ordinary arrangements that American public life offered, and Aristotle Onassis, whatever his considerable failings as a husband and as a person, represented that in a form that was concrete rather than theoretical. The world's response to the marriage was, in retrospect, a demonstration of the specific ownership that the public had decided it had over Jacqueline Kennedy's life. The same quality of watching that had been directed at her grief was now directed at her choice, and the watching came with the same implied claim that her choices were subject to the approval of the people watching, that the image she had provided in the days of the funeral and the years of the widowhood had created an obligation that the Onassis marriage was failing to honor. She did not honor the obligation. She married Onassis, and she went to Scorpios, and she lived the life of Aristotle Onassis's wife for 6 years, until his death in March of 1975, and whatever the marriage contained in private, and it contained, by multiple accounts, a great deal that was difficult, including his infidelities with Maria Callas and his gradual emotional withdrawal and the specific quality of loneliness that accrues to a person who is married for reasons that are partly pragmatic and who discovers that pragmatic reasons are not sufficient for the daily experience of a life. She managed the private reality with the discipline she had always brought to the management of the private reality. She returned to New York after Onassis's death. She was 45 years old. She had been married twice, widowed twice, had lost 3 children, Arabella, Patrick, and the unnamed child she had lost between them in a miscarriage in 1955, and had lived for the better part of 2 decades in the most intense public scrutiny available in the modern world. She had been described, analyzed, celebrated, criticized, mythologized, mourned, shocked over, and claimed as a national inheritance. And she had done all of it without giving the public the thing it most wanted from her, which was the interior. She began working at Viking Press in 1975 as an editor, and then at Doubleday in 1978, where she remained for the rest of her working life. The career has been written about with a quality of condescension that is difficult to miss. The wealthy widow playing at work, the famous name lending prestige to a publishing house. And the condescension misses the genuine quality of what she was doing, which was the work itself, executed with the seriousness and the intelligence and the specific editorial sensibility of a woman who had been reading seriously since childhood, and who had opinions about what made a book worth reading that were precise and considered and not primarily functions of her celebrity. She worked with authors across an extraordinary range. Michael Jackson's coffee table book, Joseph Campbell's mythology, Naguib Mahfouz's novels in translation, the works of Bill Moyers and Jonathan Cott, and the music photographer Jonathan Becker, and numerous others. The work was not peripheral to her life in those years. It was central to it, in the way that work is central to the life of a person who needs the work to be the thing that structures the day and makes the day feel purposeful and her own. She fell in love with Morris Templesman, a diamond merchant and businessman who had been in her social world for years and who became, in the late 1970s and through the 1980s and into the 1990s, her companion in the specific sense of a person who is present in a life in all the ways that matter without the formal structure of marriage. He was married to someone else, in a Jewish marriage that could not be dissolved by civil divorce, and the relationship existed in the space that constraint created, which was the space of a private partnership that made no formal public claims and that the press observed without quite knowing what category to place it in. He was, by the account of everyone who observed them together, what she had been looking for since the father who did not show up on schedule, and the husband who was brilliant and broken and unfaithful and then dead. He was steady. He was present. He was there in the ordinary daily sense and in the specific sense of the person who is there when things are difficult. He was there at the end. She was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in January of 1994. She announced the diagnosis publicly, in the specific way she announced everything, briefly, with the minimum necessary information, without performance. She said she had been diagnosed, that she had begun treatment, that she was optimistic. She thanked the people who had expressed concern. She died on May 19, 1994, at her apartment at 1045th Avenue in New York. She was 64 years old. She had called her closest friends in the days before and spoken to them on the phone and said goodbye in the specific way of someone who understands that the thing is ending and who chooses to say goodbye directly rather than allowing it to happen without acknowledgement. Morris Templesman was with her. Caroline and John were with her. The apartment was quiet. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery next to John Kennedy and between the graves of the two children she had lost during the marriage, Arabella and Patrick, the infant who had lived 39 hours, the daughter who had been stillborn, and the woman who had buried them both, and then stood on the steps of the Capitol and watched the caisson pass and kept her face in the shape she had decided it would be in. For the country and for the cameras and for history are together now in that specific piece of ground in Virginia. The letter she had written on the evening of November 22, 1963, was found and kept. It was the letter she wrote for her children. It was the letter written in the hours after Dallas, in the bedroom of the Johnson Ranch, on White House stationery, by a woman who did not know what she would be able to say later, and who made sure that whatever happened, the children would have the words. Caroline Kennedy has it. She has not published it. It remains, in the specific way that the truest things about Jacqueline Kennedy's life remain, private. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you for a moment in the quiet after this story, because this story requires a kind of sitting with that some of the others we have spent time with do not require in the same way. Because Jackie Kennedy is not primarily a story about a secret, though she kept secrets. She is not primarily a story about an institution that damaged her, though the institutions of her life, the Kennedy family, the political apparatus, the White House, the American press, extracted from her things that she did not freely offer. She is not primarily a story about grief, though the grief was real and was vast and was carried in the specific, compressed way of grief that cannot be publicly mourned in the full measure of its actual weight. She is a story about the specific cost of a particular kind of life, the life that is lived simultaneously in the public and the private. That is required to present one version of itself to the world while keeping the version that matters in the room where the cameras do not go. She paid that cost consistently, from the father who didn't show up to the husband who was unfaithful to the deaths in Dallas and in Los Angeles and in Boston. She paid it in the currency that the cost requires, which is the interior life, the grief that cannot be performed, the fear that cannot be spoken, The love that cannot be publicly claimed. The letter that cannot be published. She paid it completely. She paid it for 64 years. And what she received in return was the thing that the public life gives and the private life cannot give, which is the specific kind of presence in the world that outlasts the person who produced it, the image that is on the magazine covers, the composure that is in the history books, the eternal flame that is burning in Virginia tonight. That is what she gave the world. The world received it and called it strength. The strength was real. The cost was also real. And the cost, my friend, is the story she never told America. Sleep well. And the next time you see her face, in the photographs, in the footage, in any of the 1,000 images that the 20th century made of the woman in the pink suit, look at what is behind the eyes. You have been told tonight some of what was there. The rest she kept. She was entitled to keep it, and she did.